Hi, my name is Megan Edistrand, and this is my CAA for EDTP 3301. This is over language education policy in the historical context of bilingual education. First, I'm going to start off with my timeline. I started with the 17 and 1800s, and then I went all the way to 2009 and beyond. This is kind of just an overview of what I'll be talking about on my presentation, as well as some key points and policies, as well as historical context related to bilingual education. So let's dive into the 17 and 1800s. During this time, home language instruction and bilingual education were common. This is because a lot of non-English speaking immigrants had settled in the United States. They made up a large portion of the local population. There was also Spanish bilingual education programs all over the Southwest in this time. I also pulled a text from our book. The book is called Language and Education Policy for English Language Learners, Research, Theory, Policy, and Practice, and it states, Blanton, 2004, documents the history of bilingual education in Texas, beginning in 1836. And in 1848, the territory of New Mexico, which included modern-day Arizona and parts of Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, had a law calling for Spanish-English bilingual programs, and other schools in the United States offered instruction in Chinese, Japanese, French, Cherokee, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Italian, Polish, Dutch, and Czech. And this is in Wright 2019, page 68. This also shows that the United States was and always will be multilingual and multicultural, and we need to embrace that as future teachers. On the right side, I have a picture of America's first German language newspaper, and it was printed by Benjamin Franklin in 1732. Next, we'll talk about the year 1914. During this year, there was restrictions on languages other than English following World War I. Multiple languages had always been a huge part of America, but unique or diverse languages had not always been welcomed by the majority of society who spoke English. English proficiency quickly became a requirement to become a U.S. citizen at the beginning of the 1900s. I took another quote from the Wright book, and he explains, the Americanization movement during and after World War I pushed the belief to be American means to speak only English. And that's from Wright 2019, page 71. This forced many people from different cultures and backgrounds to assimilate, especially Native Americans who were forced into English-only boarding schools. After World War I, there were restrictions on German language instruction in schools, and all Japanese language schools in both California and Hawaii were closed. This was a key turning point for bilingual education in America, as restrictions came in waves following World War I. We'll go on into the year 1954. This was an important year because Brown v. Board of Education took place. Brown v. Board of Education was a major decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. The court ended up ruling in favor of Brown and therefore stated that racial segregation in public schools was unlawful. Brown v. Board made it so that ELLs, along with other students that were segregated, cannot be completely separated from other students, thus helping them have a better chance at learning English. The book expresses, but Brown also made clear that states are responsible for providing students with equal educational opportunities, opening the way for high-quality bilingual programs. And that's by Wright, 2019, page 84. This opened the door for not only equal opportunities for all students, but also became the gateway to proper bilingual education for ELLs in the United States. Next, we'll go into the year 1965. During this year, Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Before the 1960s rolled around, there were no federal language policies put in place for ELLs. Many schools ignored the needs of students whose first language was not English, and therefore placed them in regular and mostly segregated classrooms. These students were left to sink or swim in terms of learning. During the Civil Rights Movement and Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, the education for language minority students began to improve. During this time, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, was passed by Congress. Now we'll move on to the year 1966. A conference on the education of Spanish-speaking children sponsored by the National Education Association took place. It ended with a report called The Invisible Minority, which touched on areas of concern. It then described how the southwestern states use innovative education programs to utilize students' home languages. I took another quote from the book, and it says the report recommended repeal of state English-only instruction laws and declared instruction in preschool and throughout the early grades should be in both Spanish and English. And English should be taught as a second language. That's from Wright 2019, page 72. This proved to have a large impact on bilingual education in the United States, which we will see in the rest of my presentation. So moving on into 1968, the Bilingual Education Act entered into federal law as Title VII of the ESEA. So after the report was published by the National Education Association, Senator Yarborough of Texas produced a bill which provided funding for school districts that needed support for bilingual education programs. This bill eventually became the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, which entered into law as Title VII of the ESEA. In our book, Language and Education Policy for English Learners, it indicates the Bilingual Education Act provided grants to school districts and other eligible entities through a competitive grant process, and that's in Wright 2019, page 73. The final bill called for the inclusion of every child that had limited English-speaking ability. It also included children who came from households where English was not the dominant language. Moving on into the year 1974, this had two important factors for bilingual education, the first being Supreme Court case Lau versus Nichols, and the second being the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. So starting off with the court case Lau versus Nichols, it created one of the most important decisions about ELL education. Chinese American students in San Francisco were placed in a regular English-speaking classroom even though they had lacked proficiency. This is a great example of students being left to sink or swim. While the school district argued that the Chinese American students were given equal treatment, Justice William Douglas disagreed heavily. The court argued that treating these students equally did not just mean that they had the same facilities, textbooks, curriculum, or teachers. These students did not understand English and therefore were missing out on a meaningful education at the hands of the school district. After the Supreme Court case unfolded, the Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974 quickly followed. The Equal Educational Opportunities Act states, "No state shall deny educational opportunities to any individual on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin, by the failure of an equal participation by its students in the instructional programs." Next, we'll look at the year 1994. After numerous debates and compromises between advocates, the parts and goals of Title VII were clarified. There had been 5 reauthorizations and several debates and compromises between advocates before the different parts and goals of Title VII were set. In 1994, a target population and programs to serve them were defined and clarified. By reauthorizing Title VII several times, it allowed for the personal and societal benefits of bilingual education to become more solidified. The goal was to help ELLs become more fluent and for their English to remain constant. The different reauthorizations also expanded the programs that were able to receive funding under Title VII and clarified the transitional bilingual education programs were the ones receiving the most funding. Next, we'll look at the year 2001, and this is when the No Child Left Behind Act was created. A drastic change for language minority students who were learning English occurred with the creation of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. President George Bush planned to reauthorize the ESEA, and therefore the Title VII Bilingual Education Act was then replaced by Title III. This called for language instruction for limited English proficient and immigrant students. I pulled an important quote from the book that has to do with the No Child Left Behind Act. It states, "Note that the word bilingual was removed, and the NCLB uses the Limited English Proficient LEP label depicting students from a deficit view." And that's from Wright 2019, page 74. Finally, we'll talk about the year 2009, and this is when the Race to the Top was created. When Obama came into office, he set the stage for education reforms. He did this through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This included about $44 billion in funding for education specifically. As part of ARRA, Obama announced a program in which he called the Race to the Top in 2009. This provided $4 billion worth of competitive grants for states to start education reform. State grantees have to follow four general requirements that include adopting internationally benchmarked standards to prepare students for success beyond high school, recruiting, developing, rewarding, and keeping effective teachers, supporting effective intervention strategies, and increasing transparency by having data that measures student success and how they can improve their teaching strategies. About half the states were awarded grants by 2012. These are my references where I got all of my quotes and information from. Thank you.